So we have the outside covers done, and now we're going to try to attach, we're going to attach our spine and our fabric support and our inside end pages, or not end pages, our inside pages, inside cover. So to start, I think I'm going to start by attaching the fabric to this guy. So I'm going to fold this in half and just crease it, and that will give me my center line. And for this, I am going to use Aleens tacky glue. Now, this is not acid-free, but many of my pages likely also aren't acid-free, so I'm not going to care as much. I haven't used this yet. If you are covering a book with fabric, the best thing to do so that your glue doesn't seep through your fabric. Lots of people love fabric tack glue. I probably won't be using that because it's an alcohol based and the smell is just like headache central. So when I'm making books properly covered with fabric, I would use heat and bond, iron that on the back side of my fabric, and then I'd use a rice paper, which is not unlike actually those coffee filter papers, and I'd iron that on, and then now I have a backing that protects the glue from seeping through my fabric. But because this is just going on the inside, I don't care quite as much. So I have to switch over to voiceover Riva here because my kids came home and sounded like a herd of elephants as they came in. So I was laying down that tacky glue and I decided I didn't like it. It's out of my comfort zone. I thought it would work well for the fabric, but I ended up just going back to my favorite gel matte medium. I'm brushing it just a little bit past the halfway mark so I can lay down my folded fabric against that center line. And then I'll I'll glue the other half and fold the fabric over so it's nicely centered on this spine. Remember that the fabric is cut slightly shorter than the cover height, so I wanted it as best centered as I could on there. I'm trying to not put the matte medium on too thick so that it doesn't seep through the fabric as much, because even though it is going on the inside cover of my book, we won't really see it. It's just easier to work with when it is not seeping all the way through. So fold that over, smooth it all out. And now our spine will have some extra structure and support for when we attach it to the book and for when we sew our signatures through it. I made sure it was tucked in really nice to those creases and folds that we had made, and refolded those creases with the fabric attached on. And then here I am pulling it off again. I'm just pulling it off that little lip from the crease to the outside edge because of the way that I want to attach it to my covers. So I want that folded paper piece to be on the outside of the covers that we built in the first video, but I want the fabric to be on the inside of the cover because it is what's helping support and hold it on from the spine to the covers. So I'm putting a little bit more glue, and then I will line up my front cover up to that crease line, make it all nice and centered. Here, it would also be beneficial if I was using a straight edge across the top of my spine and cover to make sure everything is nice and square. I do find at the end that my book folds a little bit wobbly, not totally square. It's not enough that it bothers me, but had I used a straight edge to line everything up with, I wouldn't have that problem. So I'm putting the matte medium on the cover where the fabric is going to adhere. Again, I'm wanting it nice and even and not too thick. And then we'll spread it out over that glue, making sure to have got it right into that crease where the cardboard meets the spine. I'm just using my fingernail, but you could also use a bone folder, and you could use a bone folder to spread that fabric nice and smooth. We're going to repeat on the other side, and I'm just going to speed that up for us here. Now we're going to take those end sheets and use those to cover the inside of our cover. And here I'm trying to figure out which direction, which orientation I want to have this little flower page facing. Originally I thought I was going to have to do it horizontal, but because of that fabric there, I don't have to have it go from the edge all the way into the spine. So I can have the flowers vertically oriented. Just measure about 1/8 to 1/4 inside each edge of your cover. So if my cover, say, was 5 inches tall, we would want this to be 4.5 to 4 3/4 tall. So took that measurement, and I'm just going to cut my paper down to size. See me using this ruler a lot in my bookmaking projects. It's a quilting ruler, and because of all the different markings that are on it, it helps you create square cuts really well. So I highly recommend one of those. However, I also, as I've mentioned in previous videos, don't recommend using it the way I'm using it right now with an X-Acto knife. With a rotary cutter, it's great, but an X-Acto knife can catch on the plastic, or it's acrylic, I think, ruler sometimes, and take notches out of it. So I recommend using a metal ruler with a cork backing when you're using an X-Acto knife like that. Now I'm going to cut down this other image to size for the inside front cover. Because this is such a larger image, and the way that it's been illustrated, I am using this as kind of a mask to figure out which part I'm going to want for the inside cover of my book. I really love that skull. I really love the flower. I like the sun. Kind of wish it was the moon, if you know me. And I liked the natural border that was already included in the illustration. I'm just going to speed this up as I trim this all down because I was very slow trying to be very precise about it. And you don't need to watch all of that and how long it actually took. So I'm lining up my inside pages on my cover, and I'm quite pleased with how they look. I'm just going to use a glue stick to attach these in. I might come back with the matte medium, but using the glue stick is a drier glue, and so they won't ripple and buckle as much as they would with a wet glue. I use a bone folder here. You can also use a marker or something smooth just to smooth it all down nice and flat. And there we have the cover. So if you watched in video 1, I sorted out all these papers, and in the midst of building this cover, they got all mixed up. So I have to recount and reconfigure out my signatures again. So we're just going to dry fit these into the book to see how they look. They're maybe a little shorter than I would have liked, but I know that there were some that had that overhang. But I'm pretty pleased with how that looks. I think it's going to be the right amount of papers, not too big, so that there's lots of room for me to work on them and build them out with layers and let them wrinkle however they might. And yeah, I'm quite pleased with that. So because we didn't add any thicker cardboard to the spine, we're going to add these strips to help reinforce it on the outside of our cover, as well as the fabric on the inside. I have them about an inch or so. They were 1.5 inches thick because I think I had a 3-inch strip. And they're going to wrap around about 2 inches or so on the front and the back cover. I did that initially. I was going to trim off the threads, and then I decided I didn't want the straight cut edge, so I'm pulling extra threads out of all the sides, all the 4 sides of the pieces, to give it that frayed, weathered look. Yes, it'll be glued down once it's on my cover, but you'll still be able to see all of those ends of threads sticking out, and I kind of wanted that ruggedness of this beautiful fabric against all of my ruggedness of my collage and found papers that make up the front and back cover, as you saw that we decorated in video 2. So similar to the fabric on the inside, I am going to glue this down with the gel matte medium. However, I also have to be conscious that I am going to be stitching around these pieces, and I didn't really want to stitch through them purely for aesthetics, so I'm lining them up with the thought of where my stitches are going in mind. Similar to the inside fabric, I'm going to start with gluing half of the piece down so that it stays exactly where I had planned it to be. So lay down the glue, flip your fabric over, and then I'll do it again to the bottom side. And then I will turn the book around and do the same to glue down the other half of the strips. Just speeding up for you, again, for the sake of time and because watching someone paint glue down is not the most exhilarating experience. I'm also making sure to put glue all over the paper of that spine. It just adds a little bit more structure, strength to it. I know it's double layered and glued cardstock, but I like me some matte medium all over everything. While that dries, I'm going to use some scrap paper to make a template for where I'm going to punch the holes in both my signatures, which are the groupings of paper, as well as in my cover. I just had some pages from an old planner, use up all the scrap bits so nothing really goes to waste, and then count again to double check how many signatures I have. Now in hindsight, I need to stop making signatures or books with an even amount of signatures, because if I were to make odd numbers of signatures, creating my template would be so much easier. Because where I made that crease, I could put the center line of dots or markings for my holes. Instead, I need to figure out how to divide something into fifths so that I have 4 holes across my spine for each of the signatures. So you can see I decided to scrap the idea of the first piece that I had pulled out. And then I have to do some math. This is where sometimes using a graph paper or a dot paper can also come in handy, because you can space your dots or your markings for your holes for your stitching nice and evenly. Lined paper also can work, but it doesn't give you both directions, obviously, of lines to follow. So again, I ended up marking the middle of my template here, and then I just kind of am eyeballing it, because dividing what it ends up being, 1.5, 1 3/4, into nice even marks to do 4 across was not as easy for me. You can really see my brain struggling to do this. First, I start by trimming down my template to the size of my book so that that math doesn't bother me. I think I might have been filming this in the evening after a long day, and I was pretty spent. So next, I remembered to mark in where my fabric strips were, because I knew I wanted my stitches to go around those, not through them if I could. And then I have to reference another book, this is my fern book, to count how many rows of holes I'm putting in to do the long stitching method or bookbinding method. Spoiler alert, should have been measuring against my papers, not just my cover, because remember, our pages are not as tall as our actual cover. So I actually found, and I went to go stitch, that my long stitching method was totally not going to work with the template that I had made. But I had already punched the holes in my cover, and so I was stuck with it. I should have consulted my pages, not just the size of my cover when I was marking this all out. You'll see later, I just have to wing it and figure it out as I go, because there's not really a way to go back after punching holes in your cover unless you're willing to either take your book apart and redo it or put something over top to cover up the holes. So I finally mathed enough, and I have figured out all of my markings, or where I'm going to mark to punch my holes. So using an awl and using my template, I'm going to punch all these holes. I also learned from doing my fern book that I should punch from the outside of the cover in to get nice, clean holes. When you punch through quite a few layers, it kind of creates a mound of your paper on the side where the awl is exiting. So for this cover, I decided I wanted to have that on the inside instead of the outside. I also found that this wool mat that I use for ironing is excellent for punching into, because it doesn't create big chunks out of my cutting mat like how I used to use, or I used to use a bunch of layers of cardboard. This is just so helpful. So I'm carefully punching all of these holes along my template. I want to make sure the holes are nice and vertical, not coming in at a weird angle or anything like that, so that when I'm stitching, everything is nice and smooth and the stitches all just look really nice because the holes are all nice and even and straight. Now, because I had resorted all of my papers, they're not in their signature groupings together, so I have to stack them all, each sheet, to create the signature or the grouping of paper. So I'm picking which order. I'm sandwiching the ones that are slightly smaller in between the ones that are bigger, and then doing that for each set of signatures. And here, when I lined up my template to punch the holes in my signature, I realized that I should have measured against the signatures, because those first and last holes barely make it into any of my papers, which is not the end of the world because the other sections will still hold my pages into my book. But it was around this point where I started rethinking about how I'm going to do the stitching for this book. My plan originally was to do the long stitch method, but I'm going to have to adjust as I'm stitching. I do a kind of a play on a pamphlet stitch, but we'll see when we get there. I knew that I wanted something bright for this to contrast against that dark fabric and to contrast against that dark spine. And I really loved that hit of pink that I had included on the cover, and so I went digging through my stash to find all my pink threads and my purple to see which one I liked the most. This is not an embroidery thread. It's almost like a pearl cotton. It's a little bit thicker, and you can't split it into its threads the same way you can with embroidery thread. I actually don't know where this is from. I got it in a bin from my sister-in-law's classroom when she emptied out her classroom after she retired. And so it fit. It was the right color, and I'm going to have to use it. It is a little bit of a thicker thread, and it's unwaxed. I love bookbinding with a waxed thread because it doesn't tangle as easily, and the knots kind of lock together really nicely. So I'm going to have to wax this thread. I also love stitching with a curved needle. That's just my personal preference. You don't have to use a curved needle when bookbinding. You can for sure just use a stretch or a straight needle. Just make sure that you're using a needle that is going to be thick enough for your thread to be able to pass through the holes. So traditionally, again, breaking the rules here, I would have rather used beeswax to wax my thread, but I didn't really have any that was easily accessible to be able to use for this purpose. The only candle that I have out right now that's beeswax is a tree shape, and so running a thread along that is not going to be easy. I did, however, have a box of these long, skinny taper candles. They are from, probably 15 years ago, easily, from a music festival that my friends and I used to go to year after year in the States. And I still have them for some reason. So all I'm doing is passing the thread over the candle once or twice to try to get a waxy coating on that. You can also buy little waxing tools. It's like a little handle that has a disc of wax in it, and then you don't have to risk slicing open your thumb like I am as the thread is passing between your thumb and the wax. But honestly, a candle works just fine, as does buying wax thread. There's tons of varieties out there. There's really cheap ones on Amazon. You can go to nice bookbinding supply websites or stores and get nice linen threads that are waxed if you would like to do everything beautifully by the book. However, this is an art journal, and as we know from my videos so far, I don't do things by the book. I just do things to make a book. So because traditionally I would have gone through that first hole, it was a bit of a struggle because I didn't have much paper to go through on that first hole. And I'm starting the stitching for a long stitch journal, which if you want to see how that goes, look at my fern book videos, because I do the long stitch method in that video. And I'm realizing that it's not quite going to work out the way I want to for this book. Clearly, part of me seemed pretty determined to want to do that long stitch. I do love a long stitch bookbinding look. However, I am quickly realizing that that is not going to work, and I have to start from scratch and figure out a different method. So, similar to a pamphlet stitch where you start in the middle, I am going to start in the middle with this stitch as well. If you don't know what a pamphlet stitch is, I do have it on my list to make a video teaching pamphlet stitch, but if you just Google or look on YouTube pamphlet stitch tutorial, it is the easiest bookbinding tutorial. It's where a lot of people start. I highly recommend it for quick and easy binding methods. The difference between the pamphlet stitch and the long stitch that I was going to do is that I'm going to have to tie off in between each signature. So I'm going to have to bind one signature on and then tie off before I'm able to start the second signature of sewing. And so the differences between that and the long stitch is that the long stitch is one continuous method of sewing through all of your signatures. So I went through one of my middle signatures from the inside out the cover back into the signature closest to it on one side, and then I'm going through that end signature on the right from the inside back outside the cover. I'm going to pull that all tight and secure, and I'm going to come back in that second hole again, so it will have done kind of like a loop. We'll call that stitch 4, 5, and 6. So in 4, outside to the cover, come back inside with stitch 5, go back out, stitch 6, and back in 5 again. And there you can see I tied off. And then we're going to do a loose pamphlet on the other side. We'll go out stitch 3 or hole 3. In stitch 2. Out stitch 1 or hole 1. I don't know why I keep saying stitch. Sorry. Out hole 1 and back in hole 2. Traditionally, a pamphlet stitch is done with 3 or 5 stitches, and you start in the middle. And in these, I could have very well started in the middle stitch, so in stitch 2 or in stitch 5. It's really not the biggest deal that I didn't. This way works as well for this purpose. So we'll tie that off in a square knot, as tight and secure as we can. We don't really want any looseness of these stitches before we tie them off, otherwise your signature will be loose. So there's this first signature, and we're going to repeat that again for the other 3 signatures. my camera ran out of storage filming the last few stitches. So here is the final book. We're all stitched in, we're all tied off, and I'm pretty pleased with it. I will say that the paper is a little flimsier than I hoped for, so I will probably be adding some gesso and paint to thicken that up a bit before I start working on pages. But there it is. Thanks for joining me on making this brown paper book.